Derry, Maine, had always been a town that understood rot. Not the obvious kind. The fallen leaves clogging gutters, the rusting bikes abandoned in the yards, the sagging porches with nails working themselves loose like bad teeth. But the deeper rot, the kind that lived under things, beneath sidewalks, beneath smiles, beneath time itself. On the afternoon it began, time did not stop. It hesitated. At exactly 3:17 p.m., the world hiccuped. Most people never noticed. That was the cruel joke of it. Time did not freeze like a photograph. It stretched, like chewing gum pulled too far between careless fingers.
Clocks continued to tick, but the sound arrived a fraction of a second late, as if reality itself was suffering from a mild but growing lag. In the Derry Savings Bank, a teller named Marcy Lowe blinked and lost her place while counting out change. On Witcham Street, a dog barked and then barked again, confused, because the echo of its first bark came back before it remembered making the sound. A boy riding his bike felt a sudden, dizzy sense that he had already fallen, before he actually did. Deep underground, far below storm drains and forgotten service tunnels, something old and patient stirred. Pennywise noticed. It always did.
In the lightless places where geometry lost interest in behaving, the deadlights flickered, not brightly, not fully, but irregularly, like a heart skipping beats. Pennywise's awareness rippled outward through Derry's understructure, the sewer arteries, the concrete veins, the damp nerve endings where fear pooled like standing water. This was wrong. Cycles mattered. Hunger mattered. The long sleep mattered. Pennywise had risen and fed and descended again on a rhythm older than the town, older than the species that now infested it. 27 years. Rise, feed, sleep, repeat. A wheel that turned because it had always turned. But this was not part of the pattern. Something had been taken. Pennywise tasted the air. The usual flavors drifted in: mold, iron, human waste, fear sweat, the copper tang of blood remembered rather than fresh. But beneath it all lay another sensation, thin and wrong. Stale time. Not old, not aged. Eaten. The clown shape came and went without Pennywise meaning it to. White face, red grin, orange hair blooming like a fungus, before collapsing back into something less definite. Pennywise recoiled from the sensation with an instinctive revulsion it had not felt in a very long time. This was not fear. Fear was warm. Fear was rich. Fear screamed. This was cold and dry and gone.
Somewhere far above, in the open air of a late summer afternoon that refused to progress, 5 people vanished. Not disappeared. There was no flash, no sound, no ripple anyone could point to afterward. One moment they were there, and the next, they were not. The space they had occupied felt briefly wrong, like a chair that had been pulled away just before you sat down. They were gone, into the place where time had been gnawed thin. The Langoliers had noticed, too. They always did. Time, after all, was what they ate. They came without sound, without announcement, without ceremony.
The place beyond time, the slack, abandoned world left behind by the forward motion of reality, had begun to thicken with something it should not have contained. A presence. A residue of intention that did not belong. The Langoliers emerged like tumors from the empty sky, their shapes resolving only partially. Spheres rimmed with grinding teeth, eyes sunken and lidless, their mouths gnashing endlessly as if chewing nothing and finding it delicious. They descended upon the stale world hungrily, devouring the dead air, the frozen echoes, the unused seconds. But as they fed, they sensed resistance, a taste that was not supposed to be there. Fear, old fear. Fear that had not been abandoned when time moved on. Fear that lived. Far below, Pennywise felt the first tremor. The town flinched. A vibration shuddered through Derry, not an earthquake, not quite, but a tightening, as if the skin of the place were being pulled too hard over something shifting underneath. Windows rattled. A glass tipped and did not fall, hovering for half a breath longer than it should have, before clinking onto its side. Pennywise understood then. This was not a rival god, not a challenger, not a predator hunting prey. These things were janitors. They ate what was left behind. And Pennywise had been feeding here for so long that it had left something behind in the cracks of time itself. Anger rippled through it, vast and reflexive. Derry was its territory, its larder, its nest. No one cleaned its house without permission. From the barrens to the sewers to the thin places where children's screams echoed long after the mouths that made them were gone, Pennywise expanded, pressing outward, testing the boundaries of the moment. Above ground, the sky dimmed, not darkened exactly, but dulled, as if the color had been leached out by invisible mouths. Shadows lost their sharpness. Sounds became papery, hollow. In the frozen sliver of time where the 5 vanished people now wandered, confused, terrified, increasingly aware that the world around them was wrong, the Langoliers descended. They tore into the landscape, chewing buildings into dust, grinding cars into powder, stripping the world down to nothing. But as one of them passed near a storm drain, its teeth slowed. It tasted something else, something that did not belong to dead time. Below the grate, a pair of yellow eyes opened, and Pennywise smiled. The smile did not stretch wide or theatrical. It was small, anticipatory. For the first time in a very long while, it felt something close to curiosity. Time had brought it prey, and prey that fought back was always the most delicious. The storm drain trembled, not shook, trembled, like something trying not to be noticed while breathing too hard. Rust flakes drifted down into the slow water below, settling on a surface that no longer reflected the sky correctly. The Langolier hovering above the grate paused mid-chew, its spherical body rotating slightly, as if reconsidering a flavor. It leaned closer. The teeth around its circumference slowed their grinding, producing a sound like a saw blade losing power. Its eyes, dull, lidless, wrong, fixed on the darkness below. Fear lived there. Not the thin, sour fear of abandoned time, but something richer, layered, aged. Fear that had marinated. The Langolier opened its mouth wider, preparing to descend. That was when the drain laughed. It was not a loud laugh. It was not even a sound, really. It was the sensation of a laugh, the way you feel someone smiling behind you without turning around. The water beneath the grate rippled outward, and the smell rose up, sewer rot layered with cotton candy, wet wool, and old blood. The Langolier recoiled an inch. It had never recoiled before. Below, Pennywise unfolded. Not fully, not yet. It extended awareness first, a vast sensory bloom spreading through the thin place where time had snagged. Pennywise did not exist in time the way humans did. Time was a current it dipped into, swam against, sometimes ignored entirely. But this slackened pocket was different. It was like finding a wound in the riverbed, and something was feeding on the wound. "You're early," Pennywise said. The words were not spoken aloud. They slid directly into the Langoliers' awareness, sticky with amusement. Pennywise chose the clown shape deliberately now, letting it coalesce beneath the grate, white face tilting upward, eyes glowing faintly amber, red mouth curved in a knowing grin. The Langolier responded with hunger. It surged downward, teeth screaming as they accelerated again, slamming against the metal grate. The iron bent inward with a shriek, bolts popping loose like knuckles cracking. Above ground, a woman walking her dog screamed as the pavement buckled, then stopped screaming when the sound arrived a moment too late for her throat to remember making it. The Langolier forced its bulk through the opening, shedding sparks and rust. It plunged into the sewer, jaws wide, ready to devour the intruder that dared exist in a place meant to be cleaned. It bit. Its teeth closed on nothing.
Pennywise was suddenly everywhere and nowhere, its form dissolving into a smear of color and motion, then reforming behind the creature. The clown's hand, gloved, delicate, rested briefly against the Langolier's surface. The sensation was electric. The Langolier convulsed. Fear flooded it. Not the sharp, panicked fear of prey, but something alien and disorienting. This fear had texture. It carried images, memories, screams that echoed with context. Basements, closets, the space under beds, the moment before pain, the moment after hope died. The Langolier shrieked. The sound was a grinding cacophony that rattled the sewer walls and sent cracks racing through the thin place like frost on glass. Above ground, birds fell silent. Somewhere, a church bell rang once, and then forgot why. The Langoliers were not meant to feel fear. They were not predators in the usual sense. They were functions, processes, teeth attached to inevitability. But Pennywise was not prey. It was pollution. It had leaked into time itself through decades of feeding, leaving behind residues of terror that did not fade when moments moved on. The Langoliers had come to clean, and now the trash was biting back. More of them descended. The sky and the frozen world tore open soundlessly as half a dozen Langoliers poured through, their teeth already chewing at the edges of existence. They converged on the sewer opening, their movements jerky with a new, unwelcome hesitation. Pennywise felt them gathering and laughed again, louder this time. The laugh echoed up through drains, pipes, and bathroom sinks all across Derry. A child brushing her teeth froze as foam slid from her mouth, convinced, absolutely convinced, that someone had laughed right behind her. "You eat leftovers," Pennywise said. "I make them." It let the deadlights bleed through, not fully, never fully. Even Pennywise treated them with something like respect. But enough. The sewer ceased to be a sewer. Geometry folded. Distance became optional. The walls peeled back like wet paper, revealing something deeper and older. A vast interior that had nothing to do with tunnels or pipes. Light that was not light pulsed and twisted, stripping meaning from angles and depth. The Langoliers faltered. Their teeth slowed again, grinding uncertainly as the deadlights washed over them. They did not go mad, not exactly, but they lost coherence. Their function depended on sequence, before and after, used and unused. The deadlights existed outside that logic. One Langolier drifted too close. The deadlights touched it. There was no explosion, no violence.
The Langolier simply ceased to be whole. Its teeth fell away first, clattering into nothing. Its eyes dimmed, then inverted, staring inward at something they were never meant to see. The sphere collapsed, folding in on itself like a thought that could not be completed. The others recoiled sharply now, retreating upward, gnashing teeth in panic. For the first time since their creation, the Langoliers encountered something they could not clean. Pennywise surged forward, vast and delighted, its form expanding beyond the clown, beyond any single shape. It loomed in the thin place like a cancerous star, tendrils of fear-laced memory lashing outward. "You do not belong here," Pennywise crooned, mocking their earlier instinct. "This is my trash heap." The Langoliers fled. They tore back into the stale sky, devouring as they went, stripping the frozen world faster now, more frantically, as if eager to erase the mistake of having noticed Derry at all. Buildings vanished in seconds. Roads crumbled into gray powder. The air itself began to thin. In the midst of it, the 5 humans screamed as the ground beneath them dissolved. Time snapped forward. Reality reasserted itself with a sound like a door slamming shut across the universe. At 3:18 p.m., the world lurched. The 5 reappeared screaming in different places, one in the middle of Main Street, one in a backyard, one halfway down a staircase, each collapsing as if dropped from a short height. No one understood what they were saying. Their words came out tangled, full of references to teeth in the sky and silence that hurt. Most of Derry forgot the incident within days. They always did. But deep underground, Pennywise recoiled, suddenly weary. The deadlights dimmed. The vastness folded back in on itself. The clown shape slumped against a sewer wall, breathing hard, though it did not need to breathe. Something had changed. The Langoliers were gone, but they had not left empty-handed. They had eaten around Pennywise, stripping away unused moments, forgotten seconds, the soft padding of time. It had grown accustomed to hiding in. The cycles still existed, but they felt tighter now, shorter. Pennywise sensed it with an unfamiliar flicker of unease. Time was watching again. Above ground, the sky regained its color, but something brittle remained in the air. Mike Hanlon paused mid-step outside the library, hand pressed to his chest, a sudden chill running through him for no reason he could name. He looked up at the clouds and felt, briefly, that something had passed through town and left teeth marks behind. Deep in the drains, Pennywise smiled without humor. The janitors had come. They would come again. And next time, it would be ready. Time could eat what was abandoned, but fear, real fear, had a way of sticking to the bones. Time did not forgive Derry for what had happened. It pretended to, the way a man pretends to forgive a dog that bit him, by keeping his hand just a little farther away the next time. Days passed, then weeks. Autumn leaned in. Leaves turned and fell on schedule. But the schedule felt enforced rather than natural, like a metronome clicking too loudly in an empty room. Pennywise felt the change most acutely. The long, lazy stretch of hibernation that should have followed a feeding cycle refused to come. Sleep came in scraps. Dreams came sharp and unpleasant. The deadlights flickered more often now, as if irritated, like a wound that scabs and cracks open again every time you move. Time had grown thin around Derry, and thin places attracted things. Pennywise drifted through the Undercity, feeling the town's pulse through concrete and rust. Storm drains whispered with memories they should have forgotten. Old fears resurfaced without obvious cause. A man on Neibolt Street woke screaming from a dream of being late. Late for something he could not remember. Late in a way that felt fatal. A child refused to leave a room where the clock had stopped during a power outage, convinced that if she stepped outside she would be eaten by after. Pennywise tasted these new anxieties and found them unsatisfying. They were not clean fears, not sharp. They were fears without images, fears without faces, anxiety stripped of narrative, the kind of dread that gnawed instead of screamed. This was Langolier residue, and Pennywise hated it. Fear was supposed to be personal, intimate. Fear was the look in a child's eyes when they realized the thing under the bed knew their name. Fear was flavor. This was hunger without appetite. The Langoliers had eaten the margins, the pauses, the silences, the unused seconds Pennywise had learned to nest in. The monster had always lived partly between moments, slipping into the cracks where time relaxed its grip. Now those cracks were narrower, more tightly policed. Something was coming back. Pennywise felt it days before it happened, a pressure behind the deadlights, a vibration that had nothing to do with space. Time itself was puckering again, preparing to discard something. Not people. Not this time. At 2:41 a.m. on a Thursday, the air above the barrens folded inward. There was no lightning, no thunder, no warning that anyone would later remember clearly. The stars overhead dimmed, not going out, but losing relevance, like props removed from a stage during a scene change. And then the Langoliers returned. Not the same ones. These were leaner, sharper. Their teeth were smaller but moved faster, clicking and snapping with insectile precision. Their eyes were no longer dull. They reflected light now, as if they had learned something from the deadlights they had tasted and survived. They did not descend immediately. They hovered, observing. Pennywise felt their attention brush against it, like a cold finger tracing the spine. The creature did not announce itself this time. No laughter, no clown face. It remained deep, compact, coiled tight around the core of its lair. The Langoliers began to eat. Not the landscape. Time. Moments vanished in slivers. A second gone here, half a heartbeat there. The town stuttered. People lost words mid-sentence and never noticed. Cars drifted slightly out of lane, then corrected, the drivers uneasy, but unable to say why. This was not cleanup. This was containment. Pennywise understood then, with a clarity that cut deeper than fear. The Langoliers were not here because of Derry. They were here because of it. Fear had leaked too far, too deep. It had contaminated the forward flow. Pennywise's cycles, its games, its rituals, had left behind patterns that time itself now considered waste. The janitors had reported a spill, and something higher up the chain had approved a more permanent solution. The Langoliers converged. They did not dive into the sewers. They did not challenge Pennywise directly. Instead, they began stripping the town's past. Memories blurred. Old photographs faded. Names slipped from gravestones. The barrens felt less like a place and more like a suggestion. The history Pennywise relied on, the repetition, the echoes, the stories that fed belief, began to unravel. Pennywise roared. This time the sound broke glass. The creature surged upward, tearing through layers of concrete and illusion, manifesting not as a clown, but as something vast and skeletal, a suggestion of limbs and eyes that defied counting. The deadlights flared in full, uncaring intensity. The Langoliers answered,
not with fear, but with adjustment. They circled the deadlights.
They began to eat around them. Time peeled back like bark from a tree, exposing rings of cause and effect, layers of chronology Pennywise had never needed to look at directly. The deadlights burned, but the Langoliers did not approach them head-on now. They nibbled at the supports, the assumptions, the before and after that allowed the deadlights to matter. Pennywise felt something like pain, not injury, displacement. It was being edged out of sequence. You could not scare what had no future to lose. The realization hit Pennywise with a shock colder than fear. The Langoliers were learning, adapting. They had tasted terror and survived, and now they were developing an immunity, not to fear itself, but to its structure. Pennywise changed tactics. It reached outward, not into time, but into minds. Across Derry, sleepers jerked awake, hearts hammering. Old nightmares returned with new clarity. Clowns, drains, teeth, voices in the dark. Pennywise poured fear into the town with desperate intensity, flooding the system, overwhelming the thin places. For a moment, it worked. The Langoliers hesitated, their feeding disrupted by the sudden surge of fresh, active fear. Fear tied to the present was harder to discard, but only for a moment. Then something new happened. The Langoliers began to eat the fear itself. Not experience, not emotion. The duration of fear. The time it took to be afraid shortened. Screams cut off too soon. Panic collapsed into numbness. The people of Derry did not become braver. They became empty. Pennywise recoiled in horror. This was worse than starvation. This was irrelevance. Deep in the core of its being, near the deadlights where thought dissolved into geometry, Pennywise sensed something else watching now. Not the Langoliers. Something vast, impersonal. The same pressure Randall Flagg had once felt. The same alignment. The same terrible stillness. The tower. Not intervening. Observing. Judging. Pennywise understood then, with a clarity that felt like a sentence being handed down. It was not being killed. It was being phased out. Fear would survive. Time would survive. But Pennywise, the specific shape, the specific hunger, the specific game, was becoming inefficient, a relic. And time, when it cleaned, did not preserve antiques. The Langoliers closed in, their teeth a chorus now, not loud but relentless. Around them, Derry thinned, the town growing less real, more like a memory someone was trying very hard to forget. Pennywise screamed into the deadlights, flaring them one last time, not as a weapon, but as a signal. Somewhere, far away, something stirred. Because if time was cleaning house, then perhaps it was time to remind it that some messes refused to stay swept away. If you want, next I can continue toward Pennywise's final adaptation, intervention from another cosmic force, or a catastrophic ending where Derry is erased out of sequence. Pennywise felt the pull before it saw it. Not a tug of fear, not the gnawing hunger that always guided it to children, but a deep, resonant vibration that shook through the thin places of Derry and all the forgotten cracks beneath the town. The deadlights flared, small and jagged, casting crooked shadows against the slick sewer walls, but even they could not illuminate what was coming. Time itself was bending toward it, a slow, inevitable wave of pressure that whispered in the language of endings. The Langoliers closed in, a choir of inevitability, circling like vultures that had learned patience. They did not roar, they did not shriek. They exhaled the absence of everything, cleaning, purging, excising. Each beat of their movement gnawed at the town's structure, at the edges of Derry's history, leaving behind nothing that was not strictly necessary for survival. Pennywise surged outward, filling the tunnels, the drains, the forgotten crawl spaces with 1,000 forms at once. Clown, wolf, giant spider, raven, a shapeless smear of teeth and darkness. Its laughter cracked the night air, and for the first time in centuries, the town paused with it. The sidewalks ceased their slow hum of life, the wind held its breath, and the stars flickered uncertainly. The Langoliers hesitated. A fraction too long. One of them brushed against the deadlights, recoiling as if burned. They had never encountered anything that could resist their consumption. And for a heartbeat, Pennywise felt hope. It struck then, not with teeth, not with claws, not with the shallow and clever illusions it usually wielded. Pennywise struck with the void, with the dark spaces between thoughts, with the folds of memory unformed and the seconds not yet realized. It reached into the slackened weave of reality itself, bending angles, stretching the corridors of time in ways no creature outside the tower should have been able to manipulate. The Langoliers screamed, not in sound, but in being. Their teeth ground air that no longer existed. Their spherical forms warped under pressure, edges tearing like paper caught in a wind too strong for its own material. They were eternal processes, but processes were not alive. And now, for the first time, they were afraid. Fear, thought Pennywise, savoring it like a fine meal, is mine. You may eat time, but you cannot eat me. And yet, even as the surge of power filled the tunnels, even as the walls of the sewer bent and the deadlights flared, Pennywise sensed something else. Something vast, far beyond the scope of hunger or fear. A presence older than the Langoliers, older than Derry, older than the pattern it had relied on for its long, patient feeding cycles. The tower. It did not glow, it did not roar, it simply was. And in that simple being, the frameworks of all worlds, all stories, all cycles, pressed down like gravity on Pennywise's bones. It realized, too late perhaps, that even the great predator could be observed, catalogued, phased, realigned. The deadlights flared one final time, and a defiant roar of colors that did not exist. It tore at the Langoliers, forcing them to scatter, and their forms folding into themselves in pain and fear and confusion. And then Pennywise understood the truth. The battle it had fought was not against the Langoliers, and not against the town, and not against the humans who peered from windows or ran screaming from the streets. It had been against inevitability, against the alignment of all things that the tower demanded. Derry shuddered. The barons were silent, and the wind holding its breath. A few lights flickered in windows as though the town itself were blinking, uncertain of its own existence. Pennywise condensed, shrinking into a single thought, a single smile, a single waiting. It had survived, but the rules had changed. The Langoliers would return. The tower would observe. Derry itself would remember differently now. The cycles were no longer fully under its control. And yet, as it slithered back into its hidden recesses beneath the town, Pennywise smiled. Because even in this new world of stricter time and sharpened inevitability, there remained a spark, a single, small loophole where fear could fester, grow, multiply, and wait. It was patient. It had always been patient. And somewhere in the distance, a bell tolled, not for the town, not for the humans, and not for the Langoliers, but for the dark spaces between the stars, for the stories that had yet to be told, and for the waiting that always returned. Pennywise curled into a coil of shadow and waited, because it knew the moment would come, and when it did, Derry would scream. And this time, the scream would not end. The town slept, or pretended to. On streets still slick with the aftertaste of the last storm, leaves whispered over asphalt that had begun to remember its own cracks, and the wind carried an unfamiliar chill. The humans who had glimpsed the breach, who had felt the teeth of the Langoliers and the weight of something older than fear itself, moved through their days as if underwater. Words stumbled in their mouths, faces blurred in mirrors. Time, for them, had begun to fray at the edges. Pennywise watched. Or rather, it listened, which was the closer approximation for a creature that had never needed eyes to perceive. The town's heartbeat had changed. The spaces between moments hummed differently, like the strings of a violin tuned to a minor key no human could name. The loophole it had discovered, the small gap the Langoliers had not yet patched, was fragile, but it was enough. Enough to feed, enough to breathe, enough to remind it that even the process of inevitability could be toyed with. The humans trapped outside the ordinary flow of time had begun to stir. A girl named Ellen, 14, sat on a curb and traced invisible lines in the air. She felt it, even if she could not name it. The pulse beneath the town. The old echoes of laughter and screams. The emptiness that lingered just behind memory. The Langoliers had taken the linearity of her fear, leaving only raw, unshaped panic. It was confusing, yes, but also potent. Ellen was not alone. 3 others, scattered across the barrens and the streets surrounding the old library, had begun to realize that they could see what the town's residents could not. Shadows bent where they should not. Time hesitated in fragments. Moments duplicated themselves, giving echoes of what was happening a second too late, a microsecond too early. The world had become a series of thin places, stitched together by gaps that only they could perceive. Pennywise reached into them. Not fully. It did not need to. The loophole allowed it to touch them indirectly, feeding on the raw edges of their terror without fully manifesting. Its presence was a whisper in their chests, a tremor beneath their ribs, a memory of laughter that had never belonged to anyone they knew. It shaped itself subtly, teasing, coaxing, suggesting forms of horror that had no precedent, that were neither human nor animal, neither alive nor dead. Above ground, the Langoliers hovered again, their spherical bodies rotating lazily in the air as if waiting for the perfect moment to strike. They had learned. They had adjusted. They sensed the loophole, smelled the residual fear still hanging in the folds of time, and were moving to correct the anomaly. Pennywise laughed quietly. Not the big, showy laugh, but a low, coiled sound that vibrated in the spaces between thought. It was amusement, yes, but also calculation. For the first time, the creature was not merely hunting. It was playing. And play, it knew, was dangerous. The Langoliers began their descent, synchronized, a fractal movement of inevitability. As they moved, the very air seemed to compress, the streets of Derry bending slightly under the weight of their attention. Time quivered at their approach, slowing and hesitating in places, accelerating elsewhere. The humans trapped outside reality felt it first, a sudden pressure behind their eyes, a tug on the edges of perception. And then Pennywise struck. Not with form, and not with shape, and not with the expected illusions of childhood terror. It struck with the loophole itself, bending the sequence of moments so that the Langoliers' approach was fractured. One found itself arriving a second too early, colliding with another before the encounter was logically possible. Another struck a patch of erased time, its teeth grinding against nothing. A third twisted slightly out of phase, hovering as the air around it stiffened and cracked like brittle glass. The humans saw it then, not the clown, not the teeth, not the jaws, but the manipulation of time itself. The way reality could stretch and fold like paper in a cruel, deliberate hand. Ellen's eyes widened. She could see the loop forming, the predator and the janitors dancing a deadly, impossible ballet across the edges of existence. The Barrens became a battlefield not of flesh, but of sequence. Time fractured in arcs that had never existed, then stitched itself back together incorrectly, leaving echoes that confused the Langoliers. Pennywise pushed, prodded, teased, allowing the humans just enough awareness to be terrified, but not enough to interfere. And in the still center of the conflict, Pennywise understood something new. It had been a predator for centuries, but never had it faced a force so absolute as the Langoliers, a force that ate sequence itself. Yet it had learned something too. Inevitability could be toyed with. Order could be bent. Fear could still persist in the folds, in the gaps, in the moments that had not yet been consumed. Above the Barrens, the air shimmered. Reality, stretched thin and fraying, tried to snap back into place. The Langoliers recoiled, disoriented, gnawing at phantoms that were no longer fully there.
Pennywise's laugh echoed through the stretched spaces, a low, resonant reminder that some things could not be eaten clean. And somewhere, deep in the back of the town's memory, the humans, those who had been caught outside time, began to understand. Fear was not enough to destroy this new invader. Only imagination, only awareness, only the ability to see the loopholes and feed upon them could bend the battle in their favor. Pennywise, curled and coiled in its hiding, whispered to itself, "Yes, this is better. Much better. Let them see it. Let them tremble. Let them wonder. For even in the folds of inevitability, there is always a crack. And in the crack, I wait." The humans moved cautiously, their minds tangled with the fragile threads of reality that Pennywise had left exposed. Ellen led the small group, 3 others who had survived the first encounter with the Langoliers anomaly, through the Barrens. Each step felt heavier, the ground shifting beneath them like a stage being dismantled while the play was still running. They were not sure how they knew where to go. The sense came from the cracks themselves, the moments bent and left dangling. Pennywise watched from its depths. Its form was no longer a clown, no longer a spider, no longer a raven. It was all of these at once, and none. A blur of teeth and eyes and impossible angles, coiling around the edges of the loopholes like smoke around a candle flame. It was exhilarated. The humans were aware now, fragile as their perception was, and the game, the game, had become more intricate. Above them, the Langoliers adapted.
They moved with more precision now, their spherical bodies splitting and reforming in impossible synchrony. Their teeth, smaller and faster, nibbled at the corners of stretched time, attempting to sever the humans from the loop they had discovered. The air hummed with tension, the barrens vibrating faintly, as though the town itself were holding its breath. Ellen reached into the gap, feeling for the thread Pennywise had left unguarded. She understood, instinctively, that this was the heart of the anomaly. If they could control it, they could push back, not just against Pennywise, but against the relentless inevitability of the Langoliers. Her fingers brushed the thin veil of the loophole, and reality shivered. Pennywise noticed. Its laughter curled like smoke, low and resonant. Clever, it thought. Too clever. The human's presence was an irritation, a subtle disturbance, and Pennywise reacted not with brute force, but with manipulation. The ground beneath them curled upward, shadows flickered into monstrous forms, and the air filled with whispers. The echoes of children long vanished, the faint, choking scent of wet wool and iron, the unmistakable metallic tang of fear. The Langoliers paused, sensing the disruption. They could not process what was happening fully. Their function was linear, sequential, precise. But here, in this twisted pocket, every motion bent back upon itself. A Langolier tried to descend, but found itself delayed by a fraction of a second, enough for Ellen to pull back the thread and realign the sequence in their favor. Time trembled. Pennywise shifted, reacting instantly, folding itself across multiple potential futures. Its shape became jagged, incomprehensible, teeth and eyes spiraling in fractal patterns that should not exist. The deadlights pulsed, small at first, then bright, then blinding in brief flashes, illuminating the twisted space around them. The humans screamed, not from fear, but from the overwhelming awareness of the impossible geometry around them. The Barrens had ceased to be a place. It was now a battlefield of perception, where the rules of cause and effect were weaponized. One of the Langoliers collided with another, and both fractured into partial forms that dissolved before they could reconstitute. The other spheres hesitated, and in that moment, Pennywise struck, pouring itself into the loopholes, moving across the threads of time like a flood, forcing the anomaly to swell and ripple. Ellen felt the surge, the enormous pressure of being both present and absent at once. The humans became nodes in the pattern, their fear and awareness feeding the coils Pennywise left in place. They could not fight as humans, not with fists or teeth, not with weapons or screams. They fought by seeing, by pushing their perception into the cracks, by bending time in the only way it could respond, intuitively, instinctively, dangerously. The Langoliers tried to respond, but every attempt to realign reality was countered by Pennywise and the humans together. A strange harmony emerged, fear and perception, predation and improvisation, impossibility and determination. The loophole, once fragile, became a conduit. Then the sky over Derry tore, not with wind, not with thunder, but with the sensation of the impossible. Light bent, angles failed. The town itself seemed to ripple, as though the world were a canvas being stretched by invisible hands. Pennywise, in a rare moment of humility, realized that this might be the first time it had ever been genuinely challenged. And then, as if responding to an unseen cue, the Barrens shifted. The humans were hurled briefly into alternate moments, seconds that never existed, seconds that had already happened, seconds that were themselves aware. They screamed and laughed, not in any sequence comprehensible to linear time, but in a shared realization. They could fight. Pennywise surged, the deadlights flaring violently, teeth and eyes and shadows coalescing into a monstrous shape that towered above all, stretching into impossible dimensions. The Langoliers reeled, struggling to maintain form as the loopholes pulsed with raw, unstable energy. The humans pushed, bending and threading perception through the cracks, and for a fraction of a heartbeat that felt like centuries, the impossible became possible. And then, the world snapped. Reality folded over itself with a soundless, massive jerk. The barrens, the town, the thin places, all of it recalibrated, recomposed. The Langoliers were gone, scattered across the edges of time, diminished but not destroyed. Pennywise slumped, exhausted, its forms reduced. The deadlights dimmed, but not extinguished. The humans collapsed onto the ground, lungs heaving, hearts pounding, minds stretched to their limit. Ellen looked around. The barrens seemed intact, yet different. Familiar, but heavier. Older. The air tasted of ash and iron, and rain that had not yet fallen. Pennywise curled in the depths below, a predator still alive, still patient, but aware now of the subtle fragility of its dominion. The loopholes were fewer, smaller, but they existed. And in them, the clown waited, always, for the next cycle, the next fracture, the next chance to taste fear anew. Above ground, the first birds of dawn stirred. The Langoliers, somewhere beyond, recalculated their path. The humans, trembling and aware, realized that they had glimpsed something eternal, something that would follow them all their lives. The collision of inevitability and chaos, and the knowledge that neither truly wins, only survives. And somewhere, in the silent underground tunnels of Derry, Pennywise whispered a single thought that carried across centuries and worlds. I wait, and you will scream again.